Hi, this is Paul. We've taken a closer look at Sam, sort of all by himself for the last two videos. Let's get back to this Jordan Peterson video, and then I want to get to another Jordan Peterson video that dropped fairly recently.
And so what I would say to your question, which I think is a very important question, what's the
He asked the question about consciousness.
point of examining the self, much less transcending it? There's several points. I mean, the main one is that it is the string upon which all of our suffering is strung. I mean, it is just.
Okay, so the self is the string upon which our suffering is strung. And so again, back to his advice that he gives to someone who's having intrusive thoughts: eliminate the self, you won't have the suffering. Suffering itself is the goal is to not suffer. That's seemingly the life goal. Don't suffer.
It is when you feel as miserable as you can feel, that sense of being at the center of this torment, and you're like, what direction will you find relief? Right? I mean, this is you've got the cacophony of unpleasant experience, and then you've got this place in the middle of it, or apparent place in the middle of it, from which you're trying to resist this experience, right? Or trying to figure out how to change it, right? So let's say you have a terrible pain, somewhere in your body. There's the pain, there's the strong stimulus of unpleasant sensation, the burning and stabbing and twisting feeling. And then there's this
the dude's been burning, stabbing, twisting.
Reaction to it from apparently some point outside the pain, very likely, for most people up in the head. I mean, most people feel like they're a subject in their heads that is not truly coincident with the rest of their body. They don't feel, most people for the most part don't feel identical to their bodies.
Is this a little bit disassociative? Does everyone feel this way, or is Sam saying, projecting from his own experience? I don't know.
They feel like they have bodies, and these bodies can misbehave in various ways. And again, so you have a terrible pain. The pain's down there. Let's say it's in your knee. You're up here, now a hostage being tortured by the misbehavior of the rest of your body, right? And you're resisting. You're trying to find some way of resisting these sensations. And so it is with emotional distress or unpleasant thoughts, right? You can have thoughts that terrorize you. And all of it seems to suggest, I mean, this is the extreme case of stark unhappiness, but even in the best of times, right? Even when things are going really well and everything experience is very smooth and we're getting what we want and we're.
Yeah, I've used this illustration before and people don't like it, but basically, if the purpose of existence is pain avoidance, then I suppose suicide is the only permanent answer. It's the cocaine solution with a bullet chaser. But again, we don't. If you have a child that, and what's kind of remarkable is that he's talking to Jordan Peterson about this. And if you read the end of 12 Rules for Life, there's a good bit of that. Well, there's a good bit of a chapter where he's basically walking through his daughter's very painful, very painful childhood and adolescence, and nowhere do Jordan and Tammy imagine that it would be a good thing for their daughter to no longer exist in order to avoid the pain. This obsession with suffering can be a little totalizing, and if it in fact totalizes your world, there's in Sam's world only really one answer about pain avoidance, and that's death.
But we our favorite treats are just an arm's length away, and we're filling our mouths with gumdrops or whatever it is. We're gratifying this thing at the center of our experience, and it can never be finally gratified because experience itself is impermanent. It's just you get to the thing you want, and you gorge yourself on it. And then not
Then you want a
only,
new thing.
I actually really liked this part of the conversation in the sense that Sam is describing something about life, but when it's framed in terms of suffering avoidance, none of us live this way. If you have a child that suffers, very few of us would look to put the child out of its misery because it's a child and we have hope for a meaningful life. There's sort of an anti-natalism embedded in here. Now, this gets expressed obviously with euthanasia, as it's called, where the aged are in pain or inconvenient, and so off we send them.
you want a new thing. Then you need a drink of water because this lingering taste in your mouth of chocolate mousse or whatever it is too cloying and too much, and you got to wash that out. So,
I don't know. It is. Oh, poor you! You've had chocolate mousse.
that you wouldn't want to stay in that state even if you could. And there's kind of this rolling dissatisfaction.
So I can't get no satisfaction. Got it.
Even insatisfaction that we all encounter, even in the best of times, right? Even when you literally can get anything, more or less anything you want. And yet we know at any moment it can be subverted by something terrible happening. At any moment you can suddenly feel like you're...
I'd love to see his Big Five personality profile. How high is that neuroticism?
You might be having a heart attack, right? And then that becomes the thing that this sense of me in the middle of everything collapses upon. And
there's a degree to which this is really cruel, and in the way that a lot of new atheists have depicted Christianity as cruel. Day after day, I deal with people who are homeless, they're substance abusers. In some ways, they're sort of dealing with what Sam is dealing with here. And so they go from one drug to another, from one high to another, and are basically self-medicating that. I've had alcoholics that would tell me, the worst thing that happens is if they wake up sober. And so basically they have foregone living under a roof, and so that they prioritize buying alcohol and pot, and they live under the eaves of my church because the one thing that they do not want to do is wake up sober. Right now there's a guy out there, he's probably out there right now. He's usually out there from about early morning hours until mid-afternoon, so he might be gone by now. But basically he's on a 12-hour shift where he'll sleep about half the day. He'll get up, he'll shit in the bushes, he'll pee in the bushes, so I get to smell that when I leave my office. He will go over to the Smart and Final over here. He'll panhandle for a few hours. He'll get enough money. Then he'll go see the drug dealer and get his drug of choice and do his drug and then sleep it off. That has been his routine for the last 4 years. I know it because I know him. We have conversations. How did he, when he first wound up here, he was new. I said, how did you get here? And usually a little evasive, but if you want to sleep on the porch, you're going to have to at least give me some story. I live for stories. So, well, where was the last place you reliably had a roof over your head? My wife kicked me out. Okay. Then they all talk to one another. So then I talked to the other guys about him. And they love talking about each other often. Oh, yeah, he's a meth addict and his wife kicked him out. It's like, okay, that's why you're here. And I talk to him regularly. Would you like to make a change? Would you like to do something? Oh, yeah, I'd really like to. Well, have you considered? Well, I don't really want to do that. Okay. And what it really boils down to is I have a very limited amount of money, and I'll in panhandling, people sometimes give me food. I can usually, the Smart and Final right here, the grocery store, they throw out a ton of expired food, and so most of the homeless people pretty much get all of their food from the Smart and Final dumpster. And it's not bad food. Sometimes they give it to me. So if ever I come home from work with food, my wife looks at me and it's like, "Where did you get this?" I said, "Well, I'm kind of a gritty guy. I don't mind eating out of the dumpster, but my wife isn't having it, so I don't bring those things home." So they get plenty of food. And what that means is they've got the shelter of the big eaves of the church, and people will give them clothing and a sleeping bag, and all of the money that they can panhandle or they get from their Social Security pretty much goes to drugs. And this is a 74-year-old that I'm talking about right now. The other guy that I often deal with, he just turned 62, and alcohol and pot are pretty much his. He's in the mental hospital right now. He's no longer taking it very well. He's spending basically 2 days in the mental hospital for 1 day on the streets now. His body's given out. But this 74-year-old, he's pretty tough, but he hasn't been doing it for as many years. So where does that stack up in this little story?
And it makes life. I mean, this again, this sense of being in this vulnerable center, right? It makes life this kind of long emergency that can be pacified by
drugs and alcohol. And that is exactly what the homeless are living. This long emergency that's constantly being pacified by drugs and alcohol.
Increasingly strenuous efforts to control experience.
Or not a lot of strenuous efforts because the drugs are doing the heavy lifting for you.
Right. We have to control this thing because at any moment, we're constantly, if you just look
at any moment we might die.
Yeah. We're avoiding death, but
the funny thing, especially with I didn't expect this to be about homeless people, but it sort of fits in here. None of these people who live on the street are atheists. I mean, I've yet to really find a homeless person who will admit to being an atheist. Most of them talk to me endlessly about religious topics.
Even if for those of us who don't think about death very often, I mean, and there are those people, we're constantly modifying our experience so as to avoid discomfort, whether it's social discomfort or physical discomfort, or just every correction in our bodies. I mean, if you just try to,
and again, I liked this section of the video. What he's saying here is true, but I think there's a way in which it isn't true because again, we do sacrifice comfort for meaning. Reliably. Human beings do that. And when we find a human being that won't sacrifice comfort for meaning or sacrifice comfort for some other good, a woman who says, "Well, I'm never going to have a child because it'll hurt." Oh, okay. I'm never going to have children because they require sacrifice. Oh, okay. Well, then some of the greatest transformative issues you will simply not know. And part of what's going on here is sort of this frame here. This reminds me of the really excellent conversation between John Vervaeke and Benjamin Boyce. Now with Harris here, there's sort of a again this sort of detached. I noted that he's almost disassociating himself from his body in some ways. And so then, well, here I am. I'm this subject. I'm this self that suffering is attached to, and all I'm doing is moving around trying to avoid suffering. That's really in contrast with this part of this whole conversation. I thought between Benjamin and John was excellent. This part about transformation, and it even gets into this question of cognition.
This is the enacted aspect of cognition. There's ways in which I can't get access to the properties and powers of my cognition unless I am enacting it. I'm interacting with the environment in certain ways. And
what he's talking about there has a great deal to do with meaning. Because, okay, so you're going to suffer. Let's say you want to run track. You want to be, you saw maybe someone was a track star, your bigger brother was a track star. You want to run track. You're going to run track. You're going to suffer. And you say, I will gladly suffer in order to be a track star. Everything in life that's worthwhile involves suffering. Did Sam Harris get up that morning and say, I just really want to spend a lot of time talking to Jordan Peterson? Maybe he did, but, they made the appointment probably weeks or months in advance. And, Sam would say, well, I'm going to keep my appointment with you unless I wake up that morning and think, well, talking with Jordan will be more suffering than it's worth. No, he's probably a person like most of us that has a high degree of socialization and commitment. Otherwise, he wouldn't be the success he is without saying, I'm going to go through the inconvenience and suffering of keeping my commitments on my calendar. And this is all part of this process of life that we're living.
You can't know how to deal with like everybody and I'm not advocating that people go out and get into fights or anything, but like if you imagine what you're going to do in a fight compared to what you end up doing in a fight, there's a big difference from them, because you're not in the situation where you're confronting the intentional demands, the sudden upsurge of emotion, the ego threat. You might be like, there's a lot of stuff, and if you can get people.
And I think this is a real weakness in a lot of Sam's work, where what John is describing here, we all can relate to. But Sam's work is all someone who is well-fed, has a good income, has health care, has all of these things, and I'm just sitting here inside my head all the time.
People into a situation where they can, this is what I talk about with serious play, where they can get into a situation where they can taste that without having to commit to it, then there's a kind of education that's possible for them. This is a feature of all transformative experience. Look, when you're facing a really big transformation, this is L.A. Paul's work, you're often facing a kind of perspectival and participatory ignorance. What I mean by that is I don't know what it's going to be like, and I don't know who I'm going to be. Let me give you a standard example. Becoming a parent. Being a child is no good experience for becoming a parent. Reading the propositions is like reading the Kama Sutra. It can be helpful, but it's not going to get you all what you need. The thing is, if the only way I can know how my salience landscape is going to be altered and how my character and sense of self are going to be changed is to have a child. But the problem with that is now I'm in and I'm committed and I can't back out, at least not with serious moral repercussions, right? So what do people do? They get a dog, inevitably. Like I was talking to somebody at a conference and he said, I didn't know what L.A. Paul meant. Like I had a child and I was ready for it. And I said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, I experienced non-egoic love before. And I said, how? And he said, oh yeah, I got a dog. I said, yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. Right. So what do? You get a dog, you give it a human name, you give it its own bed, you maybe even have it in the family picture. You enter this liminal space. It's kind of a person, it's kind of not a person, and you can taste, oh, that's what it would be like. That's who I would be. Same thing with rough and tumble play. Oh, I'm getting a taste of what I would be like and what it would be like and who I would be. I didn't know I'd be that kind of, I didn't know I would get into that kind of cold rage. Oh, that's a bit of a shock, right? I don't know who I'm going to be, right? And I don't know. And violence is a transformative experience. If it's anything else, it's that. And so we need serious play, not to prepare people for violence. I'm not being militaristic here. I'm saying so that they know how to properly relate to situations without having to get into violence.
Now compare that with what's going on here.
Sit still for an hour. You'll notice that all of the micro adjustments in posture that you're now no longer making are made because...
And this obviously is the kind of suffering that goes on with meditation. It's kind of the suffering that you willfully embrace in order to practice meditation, also to sit in a classroom, also to sit in church, also to do 100 other things. It's the suffering willfully embraced.
Because you really don't have to wait long before you feel miserable. I mean, your body, the amount of pain you can get just sitting in the most comfortable chair you can find in your home and just resolving not to move is quite extraordinary. It's just, it's just, there's no position that's comfortable enough that it will be comfortable an hour from now.
Okay, so when you rise out of that into this meditative state, well, like what's your experience and what has that done for you personally and ethically?
Okay, so the starting point, which I've just dimly sketched out of being a subject in the head, right? I mean, this is something that I will be familiar to 99% of our audience, or 99.999% of our audience. People feel that they don't feel identical to their bodies. They feel like they have bodies, and now they might be told, okay, you might want to look into this practice of meditation. You might want to just understand yourself a little better. Here, start with this practice. You can close your eyes and pay attention to the feeling of breathing. The sensation of breathing in the rising, falling of their chest, or the air passing in their nostrils. And every time you get lost in thought, just come back to the raw sensation of breathing. That's a very basic exercise of what's called mindfulness. And the moment you try to do that, you begin to discover, or some moments down the line, you discover that it's very hard to do. That your default state is to get distracted by a conversation you're having with yourself, and to forget all about this project of paying attention to the present moment. And it doesn't matter what it is, but the breath in this case. And so it is in fact true to say that for most people, I mean, literally 99.9% of our audience, they couldn't pay attention to the breath for a full minute, say, even if their lives depended on it, right? It's simply not in the cards. The fate of the world could depend on it. And someone who's not really fairly well trained in this just couldn't do it. And so that's interesting, right? What's interesting is that despite your best efforts, you get carried away by thought helplessly moment after moment.
There's also a training versus trying issue here, which Dallas Willard used to point to, that so much of life is in fact willfully embracing suffering as training in order to achieve, and go back to the Vervaeke talk, in order to achieve a transformation. And now, the transformation that Sam wants to achieve is, I think, the realization that you are not a self. And then once the at least the realization of no selfness is achieved, then you can not suffer, because suffering is the string, the self is the string upon which the suffering hangs.
Now, being able to break that spell, being able to see thought as thought. I mean, so eventually, once you get some degree of mindfulness in hand, you no longer confine your attention to the breath or any other arbitrary object. You begin to open it up to everything you can possibly experience. So it's just sights and sounds and sensations and emotions.
Okay, now you sort of see where his system comes into play. So here you are in the agent arena relationship, and you're seeing, in a sense, you're seeing yourself, you're seeing the arena. Now, again, this is all on this side of the truth, because, again, the ontological is here, the whole show. This is all the truth, but this is the little place. So once you realize that whole show here is the truth, then, well, everything in life can be approached in this same way, and suffering can be dispensed with.
Emotions and thoughts themselves can become objects of mindfulness. But this is the kind of crucial, kind of almost binary difference, which produces an immense amount of psychological benefit. the moment you can really notice thoughts themselves as appearances in consciousness rather than what you are.
Now remember, these appearances are not real in the sense that for him, the whole show is real. Keep that in mind as he's talking.
Are in each moment. Because what happens is, in the default case, the thoughts kind of creep up from behind us in some sense. They kind of come out of nowhere, and that just feels like me, right? So I'm trying to...
It's a reflexive identification. Well, you wouldn't act the damn things out if they didn't feel like you,
Right.
And so they have to have that impulse to action in them that's part of felt identity.
Right. So
you're saying that
yes.
you're saying, and this is part of, I suppose, part of the Buddhist tradition particularly, although not only, that being the puppet of those thoughts is part of what prolongs suffering, at least under some circumstances, especially being the puppet of them. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so this...
And now again, when you look at this diagram, the person right here is, gosh, what terrible drawing. The person right here is the puppet of those thoughts.
But the people listening to us now can feel this. So we're talking and people are trying to understand the thread of this conversation, but it's that they have a voice in their head that's competing with this, right? They're trying to...
And there's a voice on YouTube that's competing.
Listen to us, but they're also thinking, right? And the thing is, so they might think...
And you're hearing the voice in my head as it moves its way through my lips out into the YouTube, and here we are.
Well, what the hell is he talking about, right? Like there's just some...
That's a good question.
Some intrusive thought comes in, or like, oh, no, wait a minute, he didn't answer the question. That thought, that feels, if you're identified with it, if you don't see it as mere language appearing in consciousness or mere imagery, right? It feels like me. It's like that is the self. That is
It feels like what I believe.
Right. It feels like me, but there is no me. All there is the whole show. And again, this is his system. Now, what's fascinating is that when having had a lot of experience talking to people, one of the most fun parts of the Freddie and Paul show is asking Freddie and Nancy what they heard this Sunday. What did you think of the sermon? What did I say in the sermon? Now, you can listen to the sermon and you can listen to their report, and it's a pretty humbling thing. I suspect a lot of what people get from whatever it is that you're following is, oh, I want to be like that high status person who seems to have their life together. And so I'm going to say the kinds of things that they say. And I would imagine that many, many people don't actually have, if you asked them what Sam Harris is teaching, they probably couldn't articulate it fairly well. They do, and this is where practice is so crucial. Maybe they've gotten the app. I'd love to know what percentage of people who download the app actually spend time meditating. I don't know that it would be a bigger number than how many church people go home and pray, although church people probably are more committed to it. But this is, being a religious practitioner, I have a very sober assessment of what people actually do with what I give them.
Leave.
Yeah,
and,
it's just,
that's
there's
also
no space
extremely
around
interesting. Yeah, well, one of the things you do in clinical work all the time, especially in the cognitive behavioral field, is you help people identify those thoughts in some sense as objects, to no longer identify with them and to say, just because you think that, it's not necessarily true, it's not necessarily you, and it's not necessarily helpful.
Right.
Now his observation isn't necessarily dependent upon the ironclad prison of this view right here, because that just is. And again, the evolutionary argument against naturalism, you don't know that just is by virtue of the argument itself. It undermines itself at the bottom. I did a Substack today on this, which was basically summarizing yesterday's video. And I included a couple little videos in terms of the evolutionary argument against naturalism, both sort of a cartoon version and then also Alvin Plantinga sort of walking his way through it.
Now we can check and see if any of those three propositions were true. Maybe it is you, maybe you do believe it, and maybe it is useful. But we're going to start by...
Now let's be fair here, because figuring out who you is not a simple thing. And, I don't want to straw man anyone here, because you're having these thoughts. And perhaps it's better to say that's a part of you. That's why I talk about my Consciousness Congress. Well, that's those seats over there. And they're representing something. They're representing a piece of me. And they're representing a piece of me that has been developed through time and formed in me. Or they're representing a personality or motivation or something like that. So again, each one of us are multiple people in many respects all the way down.
By hypothesizing that some of these automatic thoughts are actually what's driving your misery.
Right.
And I really also see that as a tremendous danger of totalitarian ideologies, because they're thought systems that are almost entirely foreign in some sense to the individual person, that invade that cognitive space that you're describing and then manifest themselves as unquestioning identity. And
Right.
if they're blinding the person to some underlying reality that's actually revivifying and nourishing and an antidote to suffering, then they're a tremendous block to exactly that process.
And this is where we could sort of get into the egregore conversation. I thought about making a very small video today. If you go to my Vanderclips and the video that I put up there today, no, not the free
these
one.
These paradoxes.
Oh, come on. Oh, come on, YouTube. Where's the video I posted today? You have to hit the little publish button.
By conservatives, and I mean American conservatives. I don't know about Tory conservatives in the UK.
This is from the recent Chris Williamson conversation with Michael Malice.
But that, in America especially, there's different groups that the progressives latch on to further their agenda. It's Muslim immigrants, it's transgender bathrooms, 1 month or whatever, so on and so forth. And the point I always beat into their heads is they don't really care about these groups. This is just whoever is a useful tool at the moment. And as soon as that group is defiant in any way, they're thrown into the rubbish bin, as you'd say. And the best example of this is, here we have the center-left party is the Democrats, obviously. There you guys have the Labor Party. But as soon as Labor starts being defiant, all of a sudden they're Nazis.
So I followed that up on Twitter with this C.S. Lewis quote, because what we're really talking about and what Peterson was talking about right there is, we're using this word egregore now, but it's a spirit that is working its way through us. C.S. Lewis deals with this in Screwtape Letters, where he's writing about demons, and this is one demon writing to another. To us, a human is primarily food. Our aim is the absorption of its will into ours, the increase of our own area of selfhood at its expense. But the obedience which the enemy demands of men is quite a different thing. One must face the fact that all the talk about his love for men and his service being perfect freedom is not, as one would gladly believe, mere propaganda, but an appalling truth. He really does want to fill the universe with a lot of loathsome little replicas of himself, creatures whose life on its miniature scale will be qualitatively unlike his own, not because he has absorbed them, but because their wills freely conform to his. We want cattle who can finally become food. He wants servants who can finally become sons. We want to suck in. He wants to give out. We are empty and would be filled. He is full and flows over. Our war aim is a world in which our Father below has drawn all other beings into himself. The enemy wants a world full of beings united to him, but still distinct. I want to bring in this spiritual void in the West conversation too. I it was recorded almost a year ago, and so it's one of these recordings that sat in his pile for a while. Karen sent me an email and said, "Oh, you should definitely listen to this part," and I was glad I did. And I'm going to want to go into a little bit more depth here on the questions of spirituality.
Right.
So
yeah. Now, going back to the earlier discussion we were having here about spirituality and young
Okay, his sound levels are a little low. I'm going to up it.
people. So observing that young people are becoming sort of increasingly politically active, they're engaging in this protest culture, this fight against these various forces that they've identified, and it's being incentivized by the university, by mainstream media, by Hollywood celebrities, people posting about racism all the time. And so there's this exaggerated sense of this problem existing. So all of that being true, how do young people get out of that position? How do they find, and this is a question that I really want to.
Okay, so if you're familiar with a lot of what Jordan talks about, and if you're familiar with this conversation, part of what this individual is talking about is that, and this was a big theme of Jordan's about a year ago, is that their activism has become their religion. Okay? And they are deriving their meaning and their purpose and the things that are driving them. It's not just sitting here trying to avoid little suffering. It's willingly, meaningfully taking on a degree of inconvenience in order to pursue a transformation, a better society, a greater good. And in that way, their activism has become their religion.
Want to ask you here is, how do young people find a value system to adhere to, given that religion is on the decline, given that religion doesn't seem cool, or just for whatever reason, it's not resonating, right? Ideology is resonating, not religion. But how do we replace that with something spiritual that fulfills our inner innate desires to strive for, God, the infinite being, the divine, whatever name you want to use for that?
Okay, so he's asking a striving question. We have a hunger for something. And, in the Vervaeke, we long for transformation, and we have a sense that this transformation is going to go upward. Now, the assumption is that religion is no longer on the table for a variety of reasons that people find out there. And so we need something else to function, and activism has sort of stepped into its place, but we're finding that is causing trouble. And so we want a spirituality. We want something that can fill the hunger and fill the void and give life meaning, and something we can pursue.
Well, we could take that apart. I mean,
Sure.
You might say, well, what might you replace an ideology with? And I would say, well, a differentiated view of and strategy for life. And so when I work with my clients, I never start with high order problems to begin with, like how do I orient myself spiritually? So let's just leave that aside for a second. Okay, we'll return to it. So
now it's interesting because in all of Sam's sort of fidgeting about avoiding suffering, there's a massive amount of suffering that he simply passed over. One that Vervaeke's system doesn't pass over, which is a desire for transformation. And I think from the time that we are young, if you have good parents, you see your parents and you desire transformation into them. I will talk to homeless people, and they know how they're living their life. And in the short term, they're trying to achieve, I don't want to wake up sober. That's the short term. But when I talk to them on longer terms, I would like to get off the streets. I would like to be able to have my kids visit me in a decent place. I don't want, in B's case right here, who's 74 years old, the meth addict, his granddaughters will come and visit him. They'll drive up in a car. They've got a job. How would you really like to visit Grandpa lying in these sweats that were given to him, and they're stained with his urine because when he's sleeping there, coming down from his high, it's just too inconvenient to actually be able to stand up in the middle of the cold night and urinate outside the pastor's office? Why is it that granddaughters don't want to see their grandfather there? We want transformation. We want to become something. And now Peterson, as really a wise practitioner, says, and I'll often do this with the people that I'm talking to. Okay, you want to get sober. Okay, what's the next step that we can work on? And, okay, I'm taking you back down to the mental hospital. Now, I'm limited to what people are like, well, you're a pastor. You ought to be able to. Now, pastors don't have hardly any added say in these systems anymore. These systems are functionally legal. But I'll say, you're probably going to be there for a week or two. Now, you say you want to stop drinking because you want to take the hepatitis C medication. Good. When you get into the mental hospital, talk to your doctor about that. They're not supposed to discharge you right back to the streets again, which they do every single time. And don't facilitate that by giving them the church address and saying, that's where I live. Talk about maybe you can get into a program, and this one individual has pretty good insurance. Maybe you can get into a program, a residence program that you can live in there and you can start to get off the alcohol, and they're going to have to help you by helping you with your bipolar medication, et cetera, and these are the steps. And so Peterson's right, say, okay, I almost never go all the way up to the spiritual, because in the case of this one individual, he's a enthusiastic member of a religion that doesn't believe that drinking alcohol is in keeping with his religion, yet he's an alcoholic. Okay, so starting at that level isn't going to go very well. Start small.
What do you need to get straight in your life? Well, you need a job or a career. Career, preferably, perhaps. The advantage to a job is that you do it for 8 hours, let's say, and you're done, right? With a career, you're in it all the time. Now, you'll make more money, you'll advance up the economic hierarchy, but you're never done with work if you have a career. And maybe that's what you want. But in any case, you have to have a job or a career. Why? Well, you don't want to starve. You want to take care of yourself and the people that are dependent on you.
But it's just, Rob Henderson recently posted a Finance Yahoo news piece that said 1 in 7 American men are not working and not interested in working and are somehow surviving. So even all of these little pieces that Peterson is talking about are aspirational for not a significant number of people.
Obvious practical reasons, but there are psychological reasons too. I mean, a job gives you something to do every day, just as your career does. And it also addresses the deep human need to be of value and service to other people. And so that needs to be attended to. So if you're a young person, it's like, okay, have a plan. You need a job and a career. It would be good if it was something that you could be competent at. So the smarter you are, pure IQ, the more complex job you can manage.
All of this is admonition into suffering, mitigated by meaning.
And then if you add the development of discipline to that, so that's the development of conscientiousness, that can further you. So you need conscientiousness and intelligence to be competent. And the more hardworking you are and the more intelligent, the more complex the job you can manage. So if you're of average intelligence, which you've probably figured out by the time you're 18 or so, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to be a high-end corporate lawyer unless you work insanely hard. So your better bet is to pick a profession that isn't so cognitively demanding, that's still useful. And trades are great as far as I'm concerned. It's not like tradespeople aren't skilled, and it's not like trades don't require intelligence. I am not saying that. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't require as much abstraction, generally speaking. Like if you want to be a lawyer, you have to be hyper literate and like 90th percentile literate fundamentally. And you have to be able to formulate verbal arguments, or you're going to get crushed by someone who can do it. Okay, so job and career, you need a plan. Okay, education, you should be as educated as you are intelligent. You should have a plan for that.
Yeah.
Okay, and it should continue because things change quick and you better keep up. Okay, so you should have a vision of that. People don't seem to do well without an intimate relationship. It'd be good if you could have a family and bring peace to the family that you have, because family is important, extraordinarily important. Those connections, so intimate relationship and family, whether that's your parents, your siblings, or the family that you start, you need a plan for that and a vision of that. You have to take care of your physical and mental health. You have to regulate your drug and alcohol intake. You have to figure out how to make productive and meaningful use of the time that's allotted to you outside of your obligations. That's extraordinarily useful. And you have to address your philosophical or spiritual / aesthetic yearnings, such as they might be. Well, so that's better than an ideology, a plan.
Sure. Right.
Now,
Because, and what's interesting is for some people, an ideology is actually a substitute for any of this. And that doesn't go well because it's really hard to live off an ideology.
Now, and as you climb up your career, as you expand your competence and power, well, then you can get involved in larger scale transformations if that's where your interest takes you. And so with job and career, you should be competent and interested in it. That's a good pathway to success. All right. So that's the right place to focus as far as I'm concerned. If you're a young person, it's like, well, have a plan. Have a plan.
Right.
Make a plan and then educate yourself, because you're much more powerful and competent if you're educated.
Right.
So why not do it?
Yeah, but the thing is, if you have a plan, that's great, and young people should have a plan, and they should stick to it, and they should have a vision for themselves of what they want to do, and they should persevere towards that vision. But the problem is finding meaning. Is like, what?
Oh, look, you worry about that afterwards. Look, we outlined domains of meaning.
Sure.
Look, family is meaningful.
Right.
Career is meaningful. You can mentor people. Helping other people develop, that's extremely meaningful.
Now, I know where a lot of this is going, and it's interesting because we're going to wind up in the religion argument, and everything that Peterson just laid out is nested within a tradition. When Peterson talks about the Bible being the foundation of our civilization, I saw Rationality Rules just put out a video. I'm going to throw stones at that. But all of these things that Peterson listed out really are nested within sort of the cultural package that was delivered to young people reliably and predictably. This is the default path. Follow this. You work your way up education. If you kind of hit a peak and you say, oh, you're not good at abstract thought, go to VOTEC, go to vocational school. Get a skill, get a trade, look for a partner, settle down. Don't just always date, settle down, commit, start to build a life, marry, all of these elements. Now, a little later on, Peterson's going to be complaining about the church, but notice the pushback he's getting from this young individual who is better put together than average, probably, if this individual made his way onto writing for the Washington Post and found his way into a conversation with Jordan Peterson.
Like
Right.
a lot of the high-end people that I've seen who are extraordinarily successful in the socioeconomic domain derive a tremendous amount of their meaning from fostering that development among young people.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's micro meanings to be found in all of those
Sure.
domains. Now, you still might be searching for something transcendent.
Right, whether you know it or not, even like
Well,
something
and
that,
it
something you need
differs
as a
from-
kind of something you need as, like, the analogy would be like a crutch, right? When you're striving towards your vision and things don't go your way, tragedy happens, malevolence happens, as you say, and you're suffering in your life. You need some kind of base meta narrative, something, you know, whether it's prayer or meditation or you're reading various types of scriptures, something to give you meaning, to give you hope, faith, and trust in something else, and just let you know that you're not in this alone, that you can get to where you want. You need that kind of emotional, spiritual crutch in your life. And this is what I wanted to ask you about, is that, yeah.
Now, I haven't played the whole conversation, but if you've listened to more of the conversation, you know that this individual was raised in a Sikh culture and in a Sikh family. I actually have been trying to, we have a local member of our group here who is a Sikh, and over the last number of years, he has been getting increasingly involved in his Sikh community, in the Sikh institutions, and in his Sikh tradition. And we've been wanting to have a conversation about this. But it's interesting that this individual here knows that, well, this is part of the package he has inherited. Oh, I really should have an element of that in my life, he's imagining.
Young people,
Well,
they seem to have that less and less. So how do we find that spiritual crutch, is the question.
Well, I wouldn't say it's a crutch. I don't think that's reasonable, because any genuine spiritual practice places a tremendous moral burden on its practitioner.
So let's say foundation, a spiritual foundation is what I mean.
Well, and some people need that more than others. Like if
Sure.
you're the sort of person who are, and I would say that that's likely associated with high trait openness.
Mhm.
That's the creativity dimension. And so if you find yourself yearning, well, how do you address that? Literature, art, that's the
Right.
domain. And then in that domain, there's the mystical religious domain and the philosophical domain. Well, reading is your best way into that. And you also describe the ritual practices, and they can be very useful to people. I mean, my wife found repetitive prayer of aid when she was undergoing interminable repeated scans for the presence of cancer. It's like,
Now, Peterson is clearly speaking in sort of a secular framework here, which I think is quite likely different from what's his name? Oh, shoot. Rav is his name.
my wife found repetitive prayer of aid when she was undergoing interminable repeated scans for the presence of cancer. It's like, well, what do you do in a situation like that? Well, one thing you can do is turn to a ritual. And you might say, well, that's a crutch. It's like, well, no, it's a practice. It's a meditative practice that helps regulate your physiological reactions under extreme duress.
Now, again, Peterson is sort of giving kind of a secular, I say a North American secular baseline expectation. Well, maybe if you're interested in religion, you should do this. Now, me as a pastor, I would lean a little bit heavier on that than Jordan will. Today, I recorded a conversation with James Wellman, who's the author of a number of books that we were looking at, including this one, Evangelicals versus Liberal, and High on God, and Tripp, who's been on the channel before. And it was interesting because James was processing. He doesn't go to church. For a while, he pursued the ministry, but he found that he didn't really want to be a pastor. Enjoyed being a youth pastor, but he talks about that in the video. But it was interesting that James kept saying how, or Jim Wellman kept saying how, reading, I'm kind of a monk. I like to read and think. And so he's got a PhD and he's a professor at University of Washington. So we're going to get into that a little bit when we get a little further into this conversation right here.
People who think that religious belief is a crutch, first of all, they're guilty of something I think is an unbelievable impediment to reasonable progress, which is casual contempt. Like, are you sure you know enough about that to be contemptuous of it? Religious belief.
He's using, obviously reacting to sort of the pejorative use of crutch, sort of what Jesse Ventura said to dismiss religion in his famous quote from a good number of years ago now.
Belief has a history that's tens of thousands of years old. The capacity for religious experience, and perhaps even the need for it, is coded in us biologically. It's
Right.
unbelievably complicated problem and solution. You don't want to casually dismiss it. You can
Sure.
read philosophers and great writers and great religious thinkers and great psychoanalysts. Joseph Campbell, for example, is a great entry place for anyone who wants to take religious thinking seriously.
Right. And so this is where I'm getting at here is, so you're saying spiritual experience is encoded in our genes. And I agree with that. Whether, even people who say they're atheists or they don't believe, I think this is universal for everyone. But for people who don't have religion, who just have ideology.
Well, the atheists don't watch Star Wars.
Right. Yeah.
The atheist materialist
Sure.
types, the engineers, skeptical and unlikely to personalize the world, they get their mythology through science fiction.
Sure,
and they don't
yeah.
even notice it.
But people who don't have that spiritual practice, don't have that religion, who are watching Star Wars, participating in protests against white supremacy, how do they find that spiritual experience? How do they achieve that state? That's kind of the fundamental thing that I'm wrestling with as our society becomes more and more secular and saturated with technology. And
again, it's interesting because there's behind his question an ought, a duty that I'm not disagreeing with, but it's in him partly, again, because he was raised Sikh, and it's less in Peterson because Peterson wasn't raised in a family that was tremendously observant in terms of their religious practice, and he didn't raise his family in that way either.
And political polarization, all these other forces that seem to be distracting us from our inner primal need for spiritual experience.
I would say, to some degree, that's the fundamental unanswered question of our age.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reading this book right now. Is it The Religion with No Name? It's about the Eleusinian mysteries. I should get that right.
And he will. And again, this was recorded almost a year ago. And we saw the conversations that he had about that book. Those came out a number of months ago, and I commented on some of them. The
Immortality Key, The Secret History of the Religion with No Name. So the Greek society was grounded in a spiritual.
And again, I've expressed my skepticism about a number of these things, but we'll continue.
Experience and practice that's centered on Eleusis. I hope I have that pronounced properly. The initiates were inducted into the Eleusinian mysteries. And this book is one of a long line of books, a relatively long line of books, really started in the 1960s, suggesting that shamanic experiences, which are tens of thousands of years old, perhaps older, and religious practices in more sophisticated societies that were profoundly influenced and affected by hallucinogenic substances. Mm-hmm. It seems highly probable to me. In fact, I think the evidence is incontrovertible. We have no idea what to do with that fact. Now, the hallucinogens, the psychedelic experience adds an experience.
Now, again, the Sikh that he's talking to, so the product of a Sikh culture, is basically saying there needs to be something in the middle here. We have a longing for this, and Peterson is saying this stuff is reliably produced. Now, I'm trying to think when to bring this in. Okay, this is tiny little snippet towards the end and the aftermath segment of The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. But what this one individual, and part of the weakness of this podcast is, especially at the end, they have a whole lot of voices, but I don't necessarily remember who's talking. If they had video, at least I could have a face to sort of remind me. But this is what this individual says. And I thought the way he framed it is absolutely germane to the questions of sort of how Sam Harris framed things.
If you gave people a transcendent experience that helped them remind them that there's a God in the universe that loves them and is actively present in their lives and for them, and then you say, hey, can you help us put chairs away? People will go, okay.
Now, that little thing, the experience of it, because basically what Sam Harris says in his worldview is that the ontology is set, locked in, determined. All you have left is the experience, and even your ability to manage the experience is not on any sound scientific ground, but is experientially valid because at least you imagine you can manage the experience. That's all we have left. So we just have the experience. And so that then leads to this again.
A transcendent
that believes in a creator, the fact that that has been tampered with.
I spent with these people, the louder those echoes got. Now, having seen this story go back.
This is what I do when I don't have it queued up exactly to the right minute.
If you gave people a transcendent experience that helped them remind them that there's a God.
Now, this is exactly the promise of the psychedelics. We don't have to sit and talk to them. We don't have to listen to them. We don't have to construct a building. We don't have to do all of this stuff if, in fact, there's a chemical we can give people that, and again, the goal of the psychedelic is not necessarily to give them Christianity. It's not a Christian pill, but it's at least a frame-breaking pill that will break people out of their materialism, which, again, it's so funny because Sam Harris is one who talks about the psychedelics as, well, this is what we need to do. And, of course, Peterson, in one of their comments, said, well, you haven't taken enough.
Experiential element to religious belief, religious thinking. Mm-hmm. But we don't know what to make of that. We don't know what to make of the fact that Apollinian Greece, this shining beacon of rationality, was embedded inside a mystical psychedelic experience.
Right.
Well, okay. And so our modern religions, they're experientially dead in a very unfortunate way. And I mean,
now, I got a little triggered when I listened to this because how do you know? There are millions and millions and millions of people in church every Sunday singing their hearts out. There are people all around the world who are sacrificing and suffering, and to say that they are somehow doing this just on muscle memory or rote memorization or gutting it out, no. I mean, when Jordan went to Liberty University, he was quite moved by the mega church quality praise and worship. That is an experience, that is a production that is designed to elicit a specific spiritual experience. And if you don't understand anything about megachurch America or Hillsong or the entire praise and worship industry, it is all designed to deliver an experience. The cathedral is designed to deliver an experience. The Bible study is designed to deliver an experience. The women that gather over in the little coffee break room every Tuesday morning and they share a meal together and they open their Bibles, and yeah, it might not be as powerful an experience as getting them all up on acid, but it is for an experience, and it is titrated out in a way to deliver that experience. But part of what, this again, back to the last video, part of what religion is the assertion that what we are getting at is the thing beneath the surface. And so to have Jordan Peterson say that religion is dead, then how could you account for all of the religious people? Now, I'm not saying that there aren't problems. And in fact, a big part of, let's say, the rise and fall of Mars Hill is that Mars Hill, mega churches, and again, we'll have to see the sequence that I decide to release these. I usually always release these videos the day after because there's kind of a narrative, and these are me thinking out loud videos, so these are really fresh on my thoughts. But what Jordan Peterson's saying here is way overstated. Now, I appreciate when you look at overall trends and say the church is struggling with this, but it's not struggling as bad as you might think. Partly probably because you're not going down to, well, you live in Toronto. I bet that there are Pentecostal and Canada doesn't have a lot of big mega churches, but there are places in Canada where you can go where, Paul Anleitner says on a lot of churches, the praise and worship is a sacrament. And he's right. It's the psychedelic of the church. And you can go into a bunch of places where people they've got their hands up, they've got their eyes closed, and they are in a zone, they are in a trance, they are singing their heart out. And you know what? There's no vomiting, and there's no risk of triggering a break in their order, the kinds of risks that you have with chemicals that are not insignificant. Now, I know I am triggering some of you to write the usual comments that Vanderklay needs to be more open to the psychedelics. My point here is that churches all around the world have advanced psychotechnologies to trigger self-transcendence, and a lot of this machinery that John Vervaeke talks about. And how can we know they're doing it is because people are paying billions of dollars. If you think that the billions of dollars that people pour into religious institutions in North America and all around the world is, well, we can look at the left and say because of their deep commitment to the patriarchy. No, it's or on the, that they are doing this because they are shills of a political thing. No. If they want to give money to the Democratic or Republican parties, they can. Believe me, the Democrats and the Republicans have well-oiled machines to solicit campaign contributions. People give to religions because they care about it, and the psychotechnology that has been worked into them is enormous. Now, we might say, well, overall levels are declining. Yes. The other thing I wanted to say is that many people outside of the church have very little understanding just how much social science goes into religion and the church communities. There are massive studies always underway trying to gauge these things. But actually, if Jordan Peterson wanted to do something fun, he could go into using his social science personality tools into church settings and study them there. He might find that tremendously interesting. Look at T.H. Lerman using her anthropology by going into American evangelical contexts and writing books about them. There's a ton to study there, but he warned, okay, fair enough. Some of you are going to say, I'm cheaply dismissive of psychedelics. I'm not afraid of that criticism. But I think in some ways, Peterson is cheaply dismissive of the massive numbers of people who reliably participate in things that a cognitive scientist like John Vervaeke could call transformative experiences. And churches have actually, in many ways, not without vibrant conversation across the board, have a lot of conversation about how churches deliver these experiences to people. And then the challenge, such as in the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, is that churches actually live up to the visions and the transformations and the excitement that people get engaged with.
Mean that it's unfortunate, but even the materialism suffers from the same problem. So,
wait, so what do you mean by that? That they're dead? What do you mean exactly?
Well, if you go to a rave, even if you don't take any substances, the music and the dance can produce an experience that lifts you outside of yourself.
I'm not going to pull who was that guy on the monk debate who challenged Jordan Peterson to go to a black church, but he got a taste of that at Liberty University. And all across North America, every Sunday, there are people who are singing their hearts out. Now, some are doing it in praise and worship venues with guitarists and pretty singers on a stage with smoke machines and visual backgrounds. Some people are doing it in pretty Spartan buildings with organs and hymnals. They are singing their hearts out, and they are moving together. And the number of people that are doing this in church as compared to a number of people that are doing it in a rave with or without drugs, I would say reliably and predictably far extend beyond. More people are in church probably than are necessarily having self-transcendent experiences on dance floors in the nation. The church is that big. Well, I'm pretty ranty on this one.
Yeah.
An intense aesthetic experience can do that. And we have our religious structures in the West are divorced from that.
And that is wrong. This is what triggered me about this video. And I went on a little bit of a Twitter rant, but I pulled myself back and said, "Thou shalt not rant on Twitter." What he says right there is just wrong. Now, maybe the church isn't doing as well as it should. Maybe the church is on a downward cycle right now. But to say that it's not happening, it's just not true.
To a degree that I think is untenable over the long term. And we insist upon faith. We insist upon a faith that the rational atheist types find contemptible. And
now it's very interesting. So which member of his conscience? I mean, we did a prediction show for 2022. I can't remember what year it is. I'm getting old. And Sam's was Jordan Peterson is going to increasingly be moving into the Christian frame. Well, a member of his conscience Congress that's moving his lips right now seems to be saying that because he's saying we. And he'll deal with that a little bit later in this conversation. I really like this segment of the conversation because part of our struggle in this is what frame are we speaking out of? To what degree is Tom Holland right in that this is all we are part of Christendom? I know Rationality Rules doesn't like it. I saw enough of his video to see that. We are all in Christendom. And so and I agree with this, that the debates with new atheists are in some ways internal to Protestantism.
Have very powerful arguments at their fingertips to drive home Dawkins and Sam Harris and Hitchens. Those people are formidable intellectually, and they take apart, at least from their perspective, these preposterous supernatural claims and leave everything in ashes on the ground. What to do about that, I don't know. I mean, I would say that's something I think about all the time.
And so I want to say, Jordan, come think with us. And I think he is. I mean, that's why he's talking to Bishop Barron. That's why he's talking to Jonathan Peugeot. That's why he's talking to John Vervaeke, Religion That's Not a Religion. He is a part of this conversation because he knows this is something that we as a society need to improve upon. And Canada, much more so than the United States even. Canada is far more secular than the United States, as is the UK, as is Australia.
I mean, I've been talking as well to people like Bjorn Lomborg and Matt Ridley, who are these rational optimists who note that human material progress is progressing. Michael Shermer would be in that camp as well. Human material well-being is progressing at a staggering rate, and we're going to solve a lot of the problems of absolute material deprivation in the next 30 years. And that data is there and it's available, but it has almost no compelling nature. It's the same problem we discussed earlier, that there's not a story there. Like when you take your ideologue, your 18-year-old highly committed ideologue out of the crowd and you say, look, we're going to incrementally improve our way out of absolute privation over the next 15 years. So just calm down, do something productive, and wait. And they say, to hell with you. What I'm doing is way more exciting.
And again, in the last video, I talked about sort of the religious disconnect. And this is in some ways a great example of it, where his religion is the pursuit of this better world. And, well, maybe I'll pull up the whiteboard. So Peterson here notes basically that, well, I don't see the 200,000 people lifted out of poverty daily, but what's real to me are the forces below. And let's say if someone is woke, then the forces would be patriarchy, white supremacy. All of those things are real to them. Well, why are they real to them? Well, in many ways, they're real to them because they're in their communal imaginary, which is to a great degree their religion, because religion is trying to get under in order to really move the world and move us towards what we imagine to be a better world.
Which is true. And so we have a real problem. We don't know how to marry either formalized religious belief, let's say, or even utopian materialism in the Enlightenment manner. We don't know how to marry that to the Dionysian. And
that is a really critical point that he just made there. Now, we don't know. Too many thoughts at one time. They're getting lined up like truckers on a Canadian highway. First, Christians do that all the time. You want an example from the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement? Christian Hedonism by John Piper. That was exactly what Peterson just described, an attempt to wed the Dionysian with the real world. Christian hedonism. God's, my pleasure is to give God pleasure by fulfilling his calling on my life. Something like that. John Piper had 20 years ago an entire publishing industry desiring God. I might trigger Luke.
Over the years, the name that I have given to my understanding of this massive role that joy plays in not only the Christian life, but all of creation and God's purposes in it, is the name Christian hedonism. And the shortest description of Christian hedonism is God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in Him. My pathway into this understanding over the last 30 years or so is mainly affected by Jonathan Edwards and C.S. Lewis and the Apostle Paul, but it does reach back to my father. My father was probably the happiest man I've ever known, and yet he was filled and consumed with the glory of God. And so there was this both and in my father's life that had to have a resolution or explanation someday, that abundant joy and total commitment to the glory of God had to go together in some way. And then after my dad came C.S. Lewis with his amazing statement that our problem as human beings is not that our desires are too strong, but that our desires are too weak, which blew me away when I first read it. I thought my desires were the problem. And he was saying, no, your desires aren't the problem. The weakness of your desires are the problem. You are like a child fooling about in the slums with your mud pies because you can't imagine what a holiday at the sea is like. In other words, your desires for the great things that God is offering you are way too small. Your problem is not big desires. Your problem is small desires for big things. And then there was Jonathan Edwards. Now, Edwards was the biggest of all because he came along and said, God Almighty in his Trinitarian form is God the Father having an idea of himself, which stands forth in the Son of God, and having delight in himself, which stands forth in the Holy Spirit, surging back and forth as a person between the Father and the Son. And then when he creates human beings, they
Sounds kind of psychedelic.
are in his image so that we glorify God both by having a right idea of him, true doctrine, and by having appropriate, passionate emotions toward him. That was just massive for me to see that I have these two great surging faculties in me, a thinking faculty that glorifies God by thinking rightly about him, and an emotional faculty that glorifies God by feeling rightly about him. And under all of that was the Bible, which all over the Bible says, glorify God, and all over the Bible it says, delight in God. And so how do they come together? And so I go to the Westminster Catechism and I look at the first question, what is man's chief end? Answer, man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever.
Now again, there's nothing cool or chic about any of this, but I'll tell you, for a group of people, it works. I mean, John Piper for the Young, Restless, and Reform movement, which I think has certainly peaked. But to say that there's somehow a divorce here, well, point taken. But there's a lot going on here that probably Jordan and many others are not terribly cognizant of.
And that's a big, now the thing about an ideology is that gives you the Dionysian, man. You can go, so you're part of Black Lives Matter, you're part of Antifa. And so what do? Instead of being like 7-Eleven clerk, and relatively unattractive romantically, by the way, because of that, particularly if you're male, you put on a mask and you take your club and you go out to fight evil. And, there's fire and there's noise and there's the terrible tyrannical police, and like you get to be a hero, and that's real. Yeah. Now you can say, well, that heroism is misguided, and I would say it is ultimately considered, but it's not obvious to me that the desire for adventure that possesses the 7-Eleven clerk who's dissatisfied with his, comfortable satiety, the call to adventure is real. Well, it's
now right there. Let's go all the way back to the beginning of the video and think about Sam. Gosh, this is I got to get this still. The meaning for this clerk who is going out and Canadian truckers are having it right now. Canadian flag waving, tradesmen, workaday people, they're now deriving the joys and pleasures of activism and the meaning that is bringing forth into the world. And for many, it's the Now the other side gets to eat from this sweet, religious, activistic fruit.
It's incumbent upon the culture to satisfy the call to adventure.
Right.
Well, we don't know how to do that. We don't know how to do that.
And so the whole Black Lives Matter thing, or fighting against even climate change, white supremacy, the patriarchy, that then becomes the spiritual mission. Then that becomes the goal. That becomes the vision, opposed to something truly spiritual and religious, right? But
truly spiritual and religious. Ooh, well, is that less or more spiritual and religious?
So one thing that I wanted to question, one thing I wanted to pose to you here was, so you're saying that in Western religious traditions, so you're saying that they are divorced from spiritual experience? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, they're divorced from practical mysticism. You could...
Again, it's not true. Now, are they doing as well as they could be, as well as they should be? No, but it's enormously pursued. It's even enormously studied, and I would say it's enormously stalked technologically. And even when, and this is part of the underlying conversation beneath the rise and fall of Mars Hill and the evaluation of megachurches, to the degree that we stalk it and it feels like manipulation. Well, why does it feel like manipulation when the charismatic worship leader, pays close attention to, if I hit the note just this way, the crowd just gets a little more. And that's manipulation, but the titration of your acid to get just the right dosage, well, that's mystical. See, and I'm not just pointing that out to be a troll here. I think we have to actually think further deeper into that, because again, I think there are some of these Cartesian biases that linger. And, we heard the young man, Rav, just sort of make, well, the real spiritual, well, no, the protests and activism, it is a spirit. Now, the evaluation and the testing of these spirits, well, that has yet to be done. But this little Spider-Man dude's going to drive me crazy. I keep looking at him back here. There's a little Tom Holland joke, but I'm not as into that one. So he's getting demoted, and looking at his creepy eyes distracts me. So.
But that's more of an Eastern type of thing, right? So like meditation, contemplative practice, that's something that
Well, there are contemplative practices in the West, but
thank you.
Very few people, they're certainly not popular like yoga.
No.
And there is...
And now we're getting into something that has to do with, again, the Protestant Reformation. And when am I going to release this one? Am I going to release the Wellman conversation? Because Protestants split a lot of this stuff into the nuclear family. And so there's a great degree of romanticism around the family that some of this stuff was displayed into. And some of that is already integrated into Peterson's thought and into the university. The monastery in Protestantism is in many ways replaced by educational institutions and the nuclear family.
Mystical tradition in the West, but there's in the Mass celebration, for example, which is eating the flesh of God, essentially a very, 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 very old idea, incredibly powerful idea to incorporate the divine. There's a spiritual transformation that's attendant upon that, but it isn't delivering what it promises. Not in any.
Now, I've actually thought about this video quite a bit since it was released, because delivering what it promises, I think part of what we have to wrestle with here is the fact that all things in this world tend to underperform. And there are various pieces of that. And thinking about that, because in my Sunday Rough Drafts, people wanted something out of Jesus. Jesus didn't want to give them. Look at too many thoughts. Learning not to move my lips when I'm thinking until my thoughts are ready to come out of my lips. The conflict between Jesus and the disciples that walk away in John 6 has everything to do with expectations. And so, again, on one hand, some people, well, when Jordan, when are you going to talk to Paul Vanderklay? What would I want to talk to Jordan about? It's exactly this area. It's certainly forgivable for Jordan to not have a terribly accurate assessment of what's going on in Christianity. Christianity is enormous, and it's tremendously difficult to get a handle on what is going on. Is the church growing or shrinking? Well, we've got indications of its decline. Why? Enormously difficult idea. Many of the issues that Jordan points out here, I think, are very valid. And if anyone has hours on YouTube saying that Jordan Peterson is helpful to the conversation, it's me. Yeah, there is more to go into in this area. I'm running out of time.
Self-evident manner. And I think that's not in any self-evident manner. And I think that's probably because we've lost the technology. That's my guess. Strange as that is.
I disagree with, because again, I don't believe you're going to drug people into the eschaton.
Mircea Eliade, who's a great historian of religion, wrote about shamanism and the typical shamanic experience, which, by the way, is replicated experientially all over the world, from the deepest reaches of Northern Asia into the Amazonian jungles. The experience is very similar that the shaman report, remarkably similar, but we have the same biology. And Eliade believed that the shamanic practitioners who relied on hallucinogens were practicing a debased form of the religious practice. I think I have great respect for Eliade. I learned a lot. That's another person people can read, is Mircea Eliade. If you're interested in spirituality, he's an absolute genius.
Right.
But I think he was wrong. I think the shamanic tradition was clearly embedded in tens of thousands of years of powerful psychedelic use. I think that.
Back to the psychedelic thing. And I think again, going back to some of the video I made not too long ago, the world religion subsumed the shamanistic and in many ways incorporated it as elements within the broad array of psychotechnologies that continue to be present in religions today. I should land this plane because I've got to get home. I've got my Bible study tonight. So, because this is the practice. How to summarize this rather messy video. We are not merely trying to avoid suffering. We are seeking transformations, and we are willing to suffer along the way. We're not satisfied if our transformations are individual. We desire them we desire that they not only be communal in terms of human beings, but they be world transformative. And while there's no question that the church is today underperforming, and I would argue has always underperformed, in my estimation, which is why I remain a Christian minister, it remains the best hope and the best path. That's a pretty good summary. So let me know what you think if you made it all the way to the end. And YouTube will tell me just how many of you actually made it all the way to the end.